it's interesting when we hear things over here, like for example, Twitter saying that all of the people may not return to the office, and this whole shift that's happening. And it's just really good to get your insights and thoughts on that, Sarah, because we're such an office-based community here.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of thinking, my goodness, how do we kind of replicate our office community with this virtual office community, and what's the upside and what's the downside?
Yeah, I mean, it is a whole new world. I will tell you, it is definitely easier, right? We're in such a position of privilege as tech companies because it's very easy to have a work from home of a virtual workforce. And frankly, we've had some of that go on for long periods of time because I have engineers, around the US, many of whom only work from home. So I only see them through a video conference. But clearly this is an extreme kind of example of that. I think a couple of things. I mean, one, just I call it turn the bug into a feature. So things like all hands for us, right? We now have a Friday all hands for the whole company. It's all done digitally. We used to always have this pushback that it was really hard to include the regions, as we call them, or the countries, because it's a little off time zone. But more than that, it was always weird if you had, a couple hundred people in person, and then you had this one kind of discombobulated head on a screen. And now, since everyone is kind of a discombobulated head on a screen, it's been a wonderful, easy way to bring, for example, my head of EMEA will actually manage our whole all hands on Friday. The head of Australia was on 2 weeks ago. Head of Canada was on. And so you're seeing a lot more different faces and different leaders able to actually be much more in front of the company on a regular basis instead of waiting for that moment where they fly into San Francisco. So I would kind of suggest to everyone listening, like, think about it as like, where could it become a feature, not a bug? Like even having experts that you never thought about being able to drop into your meeting, now you can do it, right? Because if someone says to me, like you did, hey, will you do this for half an hour? That is a very easy ask versus flying to Belfast, getting in a cab or a taxi, getting to your office, getting all set up, right? That's serious investment. And so I think there's a lot of ability to suddenly have people join you that are experts that maybe you couldn't have had before. The other thing I'm thinking a lot about, so there's kind of two other things. One is the creativity and the serendipity of when people are together. I think they're often very creative in real life. They're kind of, it's that, people talk about the water cooler conversation or the bumping into people. It's not what goes on in the meeting, it's the conversation you had going into the meeting or coming out of the meeting or standing in the kitchen together. So how do we keep that serendipity of creativity alive? And then the second piece for me is all about kind of social capital. So it's very related to what we do for a living at Nextdoor, which is this idea of like in real life interactions really fill social capital buckets up, which allow you to kind of create much stronger communities. So I don't want to swing too much into this virtual world and imagine that all is great, because actually what we may be doing in some ways is just depleting the social capital that we've created with others over periods of time, right? It is those conversations in between meetings or those little moments when you just ask someone, hey, how are you doing? And when you're in a very rigorous, structured world of meetings, you lose that social moment. And so I'm trying to think about ways where we can fill that. So for example, we've been doing virtual cocktail hours at the end of every week so we'll kind of ask people to sponsor them. So we'll do a half-hour session, 5 people lead. They'll give it a call, like someone had the Cinco de Mayo cocktail, someone had the West Coast Comms cocktail. And I was able to jump around and kind of spend 5 minutes in each one. And then we flipped for the second half hour and did the same thing. So as a CEO, it was a great way to kind of informally just say hello to a lot of people over the course of an hour. And then we've also had like the kids of Nextdoor. So we've been trying to think about like, how do we recognize the fact that we're working from home? And is there an interesting way? I've even been thinking about an interesting way for me to talk to a bunch of, say, young women that I wouldn't get the chance to talk to about what it's like to be a woman in the workforce. So again, how do you turn it into a feature and not just a bug?
Yeah, and I think just on the female bit that you touched on, which is one of the reasons why our paths have crossed, and you've obviously launched Ladies Who Launch, and I've tried to help support in my own little small way. And You know, you've always been one of my heroes. You are. I think you're amazing. And I think you're one of the most genuinely giving people I've ever met. I've had the privilege to meet. And this other great leader has popped up, which is Jacinta Doran from New Zealand. And you know, in a way, you know, I see a lot of similarity between how you lead and how she leads, and the kind of empathy and the strong communication skills that you both have. And I was just wondering, you know, have you kind of noticed some of that leadership in people like Jacinta Ardern and female leadership getting more of a moment currently?
I mean, I certainly hope so. So first, you've been way too kind. But I do think there are traits of female leadership, like you don't want to get too stereotypical, but I think that women do tend to be higher on the communication spectrum, like often over communicators. And I think this is a moment in time when honestly, I don't think you can communicate enough. So always keep that phrase in mind, like as someone who is, this is what you do for a living, you know this phrase well, but I always say until you're sick of saying it, no one has heard you. And so I think often, like a lot of folks I work with will say it once and they're like, well, we told everyone. And I'm like, no, that was not communicating. So I think there's the really high on the spectrum of communication and over communication. I think the second thing is women tend to be more empathetic and more transparent on both the upside and the downside. So, and maybe more willing actually sometimes to be open about their vulnerabilities. And I think this is a moment when, as leaders, you actually have to be very empathetic, but also very vulnerable. And people want to know, kind of even personally, like, how are you doing? How are you coping with feeling more isolated? How are you coping with the things that might be going on more broadly in your family context, for example? Like I get asked by a lot of the younger women at Nextdoor, how am I coping with having 2 kids at home at the same time as trying to also run a business? And so I think there's more of that empathy. I also think though, there's less ego. Women often are much more data-driven, and this has been a time to be data-driven, right? You needed to just kind of act and not overthink it. And so I think, you know, whether it's women or just leaders in general who moved quickly have definitely, I think, you know, come out the other side of this looking a lot more leaderly, because the data was there to be seen. And I think the more you tried to listen to anecdotes and so on, the more tossed around by the kind of storm of COVID-19 you became, versus if you just looked at the numbers, it was clear that moving to shelter in place was important. It was clear if we went through this lockdown, we could flatten the curve and make sure that our medical services didn't get overwhelmed. And now that we're kind of coming out the other side, it's clear that we need testing, we need tracing, we need to be mindful when hotspots crop up and kind of lock those down, but that we can get back to work or back to some sort of new normal pre a vaccine, that can work though. But again, you need to be very data driven. And I think people need to be willing to act as a community and know that sometimes you're going to have to do things for the good of the community, like shelter in place.
I mean, that's been the interesting thing. I think we've all become like data hungry, like everyone, even those of us that it wouldn't be in our DNA. And also I look at Nextdoor, which is obviously a business with real purpose, but I'm sure you could never have imagined that the purpose of Nextdoor would be as important as it could potentially be in terms of helping with that tracing, testing, isolating kind of regime that we're all going to have to live with over the next, you know, months or years.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really fascinating themes emerging, many of which I hope that we don't lose as, you know, maybe normal comes back again. I think one is definitely this rise of local and the importance of your neighbors. Like, in Northern Ireland, I've never felt like I need to evangelize that. Like, people are very neighborly. Some of our best next door neighborhoods are in and around Belfast, for example. In fact, I was at one of your community centers in February, right before it. We literally flew home, and then I feel like shelter in place happened within like a week. But just seeing, I mean, it's why I care so much about community, is because it all started there, frankly. So that's one huge theme. I think there is a rise of the conscious consumer. And what I mean by that is, as people have kind of seen things like either it's less plane flying, less car driving, so less carbon being released into the atmosphere, better for our planet. As people frankly have less work, they're also very conscious about what's in their bank account. And so people are more focused on things like reusing, repurposing, recycling. We have a segment on Nextdoor called For Sale and Free, which is a classifieds business, and it is through the roof right now. Now it's a combo of we've all been at home, so I personally have cleared up my garage like nobody's business. Even my dad, who I don't think has been in his garage for like 2 decades, has cleaned that thing out. And so there's kind of this unleashing of that into the world to say, hey, does anyone need some of this stuff? But I do think people are also being mindful of the environment and being mindful of their savings. And then the final kind of trend that I'm really focused on is health. So clearly a pandemic brings your health to the fore. As people think about going back to work, are you willing to have your temperature checked? Are you willing to get a test, for example, that's very medical in nature? But there's also our mental health. This is actually Mental Health Awareness Month. I think right now it's Mental Health Awareness Week in the UK. But for a lot of people, isolation has been, very tough on them. There's a lot of loneliness in communities like the elderly, the disabled, and there was a spotlight where people started to understand the need to go help those communities as we get busy again. I want to make sure we don't forget about them if the last thing you want to say, oh, get left behind.
Yeah, and I think, in our own community or in the community I live in, we've been really mindful of the older people that live near us and beside us. And I think they're being really well looked after. I actually worry about some of the younger isolated people who maybe work really hard and are living on their own in an apartment and, they don't have the kind of fraternity of their kind of colleagues around them. And I think I'm nearly more concerned about them because I think people think, well, they're all okay. We'll take care of the elderly, but there's this other cohort of people that I think do need support. And I think a lot of working parents like yourself with young kids, my kids are more grown up now, so I can't say they've been a burden at the moment, but working couples who are trying to homeschool, I mean, they're feeling really stressed at the moment. And I think it's, how much, lax is there for them when they get back into the system again. Employers have to be really empathetic and caring because their employees, whilst working from home, have been under quite a lot of stress and strain, and it's been a different type of stress and strain. So I think the whole mental health awareness piece is really important.
Yes.
And Sarah, like as companies are moving towards recovery, I mean, even here in Belfast City Council is really looking at how we build back better. And I really love that term. And I think it's the right direction. So as we look to build back better and as we look to rebuild our businesses, etc., how can we do them more with purpose and more with a social conscience and taking in things like the environment and sustainability. But also for those kind of female entrepreneurs that are getting out there and launching their own businesses, this is tough. This can be a real setback. So what advice do you have in the kind of bigger picture about Build Back Better, and then to those entrepreneurs that are part of your Ladies Who Launch community? What kind of advice do you have for them?
Yeah, on the Build Back Better, which I love, what a good catchy phrase. I'm working personally right now with Governor Newsom here in the state of California. And he has a whole task force. I think he's actually been one of the leaders I've looked to that has done very well during this crisis, both moving quickly, but also on the way out, recognizing that he doesn't have all the answers. Like I often say to my team, if we're all depending on me for the good ideas, we are screwed. So let's not do that. And so I think similarly, he's a good example in my mind of a leader that's reaching out across the spectrum. So definitely the private sector, but also being conscious of, California has a very strong union culture. California has a very strong agriculture sector. I mean, things when you hear California, I think, sitting maybe in Northern Ireland, you think tech, but there's agriculture, there's all of the farming that goes on. We have a huge immigrant population, right? The Hispanic population in California is massive, big homeless problems, like lots of different constituents. And I think getting them into the mix, something to think about even, with a Belfast City Council or just broadly in Northern Ireland, like how could Stormont bring together all of these disparate brains, because that's, I think, how you get good ideas. The two places that I'm focused on for Governor Newsom, one is small businesses, which brings you to that kind of Ladies Who Launch piece. I'm really concerned that small businesses right now are being completely decimated. You can't just look at small businesses as an aggregate group because there's so much diversity under the hood. So right now we're trying to kind of stratify it into things like if you're in the food area, how do you think about food preparation? Can you do delivery, pickup, and so on? Because restaurants, I don't think, are just going to bounce back to like how they were. like we're talking here in California about 6 feet apart, seating, and so on, which means your density is probably dropped by about 50%. For a lot of restaurants, that means their business model just became completely untenable. In retail, clearly helping retailers shift more quickly to digital is important. I was talking to a good friend who I went to school with. My girlfriends are still some of my closest crew back in Northern Ireland. She works for kind of a small clothing shop in Waringstown. And she was talking about how they have no online presence and have never even thought to have an online presence. And so I think for a lot of those businesses, we've got to help coach them and mentor them and give them those tools. And then when you get into more services based, right, there's clearly services like you that are already pivoting and thriving and thinking about the use of digital. I think there's also the tail of services that is more health and wellness. So like I can't wait to see my hair salon. But people who do things that are more physical in nature, they may take even longer again to be able to come back. If you go kind of more soup to nuts, it's like, what are the regulations for small businesses that could change or be alleviated? How do you make sure they're getting access in the UK to bounce back loans, in the US what we call PPE? Like there's a whole conundrum there. And then finally, one of the things we're trying to push here in California is this idea of a small business month. So how do we really get neighbors to lean in? Because I think it's a grassroots effort. Literally, how do you get me to spend local and to feel safe spending local? So a big push on that front around SMBs. And then on the female front, like I do worry a lot that we're going to see minorities and female-run businesses set back, 1, 2, 3, maybe a decade. But my advice to them would be, first of all, there is help out there. So as much as possible, go to all the places you would for resources. We've tried to do a lot with Ladies Who Launch on that front. Definitely look to your mentors. You're not alone. Peer mentorship, I think, is fantastic at this moment in time. So find out what the people around you are doing. And I do think it is a moment in time to grab the purpose. Like, again, going back to what's the feature, not the bug of the crisis, and how could you form businesses around it? I think there's real learning about the new normal that we'll move to.
Yeah, and I think, even hearing you talk through that is going to be really helpful for some of the SMEs that are going to connect into this recording, because I'm doing a couple of webinars the next few weeks and they are focused at SMEs because they do need a lot of help and support. And I think they need encouragement, and they need to be given confidence that they can pivot and they can transition their business into a new way. And they need to look towards some big businesses to see how they've done it. And actually, some of the examples from big business, some of the things they put in place to create safe working environments, they're really quite simple. Yeah. So I think it's about having some of those things that seem really big and complex broken down into simple, practical steps, and just finding support within your community, whether it's your business community or your neighborhood community or your peer group community, to help you on that kind of journey. Because I do worry about all of the people who are motivated to run their own businesses and kind of struggling at the moment with where they're going to go in the next couple of months. But
just don't be afraid to ask for help though. Like that, it's not a human condition. Like we saw this a lot on Nextdoor in the beginning of the crisis, right? A lot of people wanted to give help. And for the people who needed help, particularly the elderly or the vulnerable at that moment, it was almost really hard to get them to accept help. Like I was paired to a woman here in my neighborhood, and she's in her 60s, and she actually spent about the first 20 minutes of the phone call where I called her to say, what can I do? Explaining why she didn't need any help. I was like, okay, but like, is there just something? And then it turned out, she couldn't leave her home. So I went and got like some prescriptions for her, got some groceries. I think the same is true of small businesses or any business, right? It's hard to ask for help. But my local restaurant, I love, because it's a husband and wife duo. Their son and my daughter were in preschool together. So like, I love them. I love Holly and Dan. I want them to survive, right? They just reached out and said, hey, we're still doing delivery and all of that, but beyond that, we're going into some groceries because we're trying to support up the value chain, the people who sell meat, the people who sell cheese, like that are all within like a 50-mile radius. And so like I did half my grocery shopping in the local restaurant last night, which is kind of weird because like it's not the place I would have thought to go, but I just wanted to spend money with them. And tonight I'm going to walk down and collect it. So I'm really excited because I'll get a chance to talk to them.
And you got your exercise because you walked down to collect it. And I think what's really important is we all kind of want to know the provenance of our food. And
Yeah.
I think that buying local and supporting local is just going to become more important. No, look, I know I'm going to wrap up in a few minutes because I know your time is really precious. But I just want to ask you, so what has been your guilty pleasure during lockdown? Sarah, here we've all been watching Normal People, but I'm dying to know what's been the thing that you kind of delved into, and what's the restaurant you want to visit first when kind of the new normal comes around?
Well, that's easy because that would be Marché au Fleur, which is my local restaurant. I can't wait to go down and spend a little time with them. But on the guilty pleasures, one has actually been hiking a ton. So every night I walk out of this little office that I'm in and I talk about my commute because I used to have like over an hour car commute. And so now I go walk, like I'm lucky because I live right on a mountain. So I can go walk the mountain. And it's a guilty pleasure because I do know that like my kids and my husband have also not seen me all day. And they're kind of like the first couple of times they were like, you're not gonna like help us get dinner. And I'm like, I am, but like you have to wait for like 35 minutes because I need a brain break. So that's a selfish, like it's guilty because it feels a little selfish, but it goes back to that mental health. It allows me to come down off of, the adrenaline of work, and I can actually become like a real human being again. So it's in their interest that I go take that hike. My kids and I, like as a family, we love board games, but my God, we are the kings and queens of board games right now. You need a board game? We got it. So we just pulled out something called Code Names last night that we'd never played before. And then finally, we did get into like, I will admit it, Survivor, which like, I never thought I would watch Survivor in my life. And it was my general counsel at next door told me it was like a great family thing. And I was like, really? And so we have just been glued to Survivor for the last few weeks.
Well, I thought your kids just love the fact they've got you in the house. And look, Sarah, that's been really, really helpful. And I want to share some of the things that you've shared with me today because I always find you really motivating and energizing and inspirational. And so we're going to wrap this up in the podcast and we're going to get it out there.